Bé, bona tarda. Si els sembla, donem inici ja a aquest cicle de diàlegs. Honorable cònsol d'Alemanya, honorable cònsol de Suïssa, director del Goethe, Thomas, que es coneix al cicle. Benvinguts a l'Ateneu i benvinguts a la celebració d'aquest Tricentenari de Kant. Ens fa molta il·lusió celebrar aquest Tricentenari, sobretot gràcies al Goethe que hem pogut organitzar-lo. 3 taules rodones sobre Kant de primeríssim nivell, amb els millors conferenciants del món, podem dir. No és el primer acte que celebrem sobre Kant a l'Ateneu barcelonès. Vam celebrar ja la presentació de la crítica de la raó pura en català i vull dedicar també aquest cicle de diàlegs al Miquel Montserrat, que és el traductor que desgraciadament ens va deixar poc després de presentar-la, així que dediquem aquests actes kantians a ell. Ja no m'entretinc més, benvinguts a l'Ateneu, també els que esteu seguint en streaming. Seran 2 dies kantians, dintre la Biennal del Pensament també, que ens fa molta il·lusió participar-hi per primer cop, i ja li dono la paraula al senyor cònsol. Gràcies.
Bona tarda a tots. Permítame, sisplau, continuar en inglès. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to express both our support and our gratitude for organizing this Congress. Your presence here is proof that Kant's thinking and philosophy is discussed and reflected by each generation, also here in Catalonia. And to focus on education guarantees Kant's impact on generations to come. Let me start by thanking our host, Don Jordi, for providing his space for this event. The Ateneo has been a meeting place for intellectuals for more than 160 years, and I hope this tradition will inspire the upcoming debates. I would equally want to thank el director de Instituto Goethe, Senor Roland Gretz, whose tireless commitment, his experience, and his dedication have made this event possible, pursuing the mission of the Goethe Institute, which is to promote cultures between Germany and the world. And allow me to express my appreciation, dear Professor Sturm, as professor at the Department of Philosophy at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona and renowned Kant expert. You have invested enormous energy and expertise to bring about the concept of this series of debates. On behalf of the German government, I wish to congratulate you on this project you set up at an important and adequate moment in time. Of course, Kant is on many agendas this year due to his anniversary, but as our head of state has put it, the tremendous actual interest in Kant's philosophy is also caused by great concern about the state of our world these days. In his work Zum ewigen Frieden, on perpetual peace, a title that unfortunately sounds like a utopia today, and especially in light of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, Kant discussed the need to replace war by legal and moral principles. These thoughts are widely reflected in the basic values which Germany is adhering to in the field of worldwide relations. None else but the German Bundeskanzler pointed out in his speech on Kant's anniversary on April 22 this year, I quote, "Not a single one of the factors, of the ingredients Kant considered necessary for sustainable peace has by his time proven to be practicable, leave alone be established." Since then, many of these aspects and ideas did become reality in Germany, in the European Union, partly even on a global scale. End of quote. For one thing is clear, even if the title of his work may seem utopian, Kant had no illusions about the human nature. He regarded war as a normal state of affairs and emphasized that peace must always be established by continuous efforts. Some of us, at least in my generation, might have hoped the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact would have brought an end to war in Europe. Even the end of history was proclaimed. We were wrong, and we cannot rest on any laurels. Therefore, it's not only welcome but necessary that you are here about to reflect on education, responsibility, maturity, today and tomorrow. We do wish you instructive and inspiring debates that encourage all of us to keep on reflecting on our responsibility as citizens for our continent and for our children. It needs personalities to understand about the enlightenment, to reflect about the imperative in an autonomous spirit of responsibility. Thank you very much. Merci and sapere aude.
Bona tarda. Benvolgut cònsol general, senyor de Grotenberg, benvolgut cònsol general, senyor Ottmar Hadecker, benvolguts conferenciants, Susan Neiman, Sabine Döring, Martin Stricker, José Luis Martí, Francisc Chevenal i el moderador, el Daniel Gamper. Estimats amics i companys, senyors i senyores, aquesta conferència de 2 dies requereix una planificació complexa. Per això no vull fer res més que donar-vos les gràcies en aquest moment, perquè això és, jo crec, important. M'agradaria donar les gràcies al Consolat General de la República Federal d'Alemanya per el seu generós suport financer. El mateix passa amb el Consolat General de Suïssa i el grup empresarial Amigos Goethe Institut Espanya. Voldria agrair al nostre excel·lent soci, l'Ateneu barcelonès, estimat Jordi, per la magnífica col·laboració i m'alegra que aquest acte formi part de la Biennal del Pensament de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona. Finalment, m'agradaria donar les gràcies a tots els companys del Goethe Institut, Bettina Bremme, Ursula Wahl, que m'han ajudat, i sobretot a tu, Thomas Sturm, professor, per l'excel·lent curació i la planificació elaborada d'aquests dies. Estic molt content que hagi pres la iniciativa del Goethe Institut de fer un acte amb motiu de l'aniversari de Kant i que hagi desenvolupat els temps per a Kant, l'educació per la llibertat. M'agradaria donar les gràcies a tots els conferenciants per haver vingut i és un plaer i un honor per nosaltres tenir-vos aquí. Finalment, m'agradaria donar les gràcies a vosaltres, senyors i senyores, per haver vingut. Moltes gràcies i amb això donaré la paraula per a Thomas Sturm. Gràcies.
Podemos cambiar la presentación. Can we change the presentation, please? Oh, excellent. I need a remote control. Well, I can manage from here. Okay, we are celebrating Kant's 300th birthday, and I'm happy to have such a big party here with all of you together, and thanks to all for coming, especially to the 2 consuls that were mentioned, and my pleasure to give the thanks back to all who helped me in organizing this. So we are celebrating Kant's 300th birthday, and he's known for ideas that have helped to shape our world, insofar as philosophers can be said to shape the world. For instance, for the determination of limits of human knowledge, for the categorical imperative as a principle of morality, for the concept of enlightenment with the demand to think for oneself, or for his idea, already mentioned, of a peace order based on a global federation of republics. For Kant, education is very closely connected to some of these innovative ideas. As we know, he spends much time connecting things systematically and thinking them through, sometimes in nerve-wracking ways, as one of his friends, Moses Mendelssohn, said. But that is partly why we can still learn from him today. While our panelists, myself included, will take inspirations from Kant, we will also disagree with him where necessary, and we will address the needs and challenges of today. So let me first say a few general words about Kant on education, and then I turn to my topic, education towards maturity as a basic aspect of an education towards freedom. Let's see if I can manage this. Yes. So Kant had very progressive ideas for education. He claimed that states should cut military budgets for investing more into education, and he wanted to reform education as it was back then. He assumes that education is necessary, first because of the biological limits of we human beings, Like all animals, we do have instincts, such as for survival, food, or sex. Yes, Kant wrote about that. And instincts and the powers needed to satisfy these instincts develop more or less automatically or in pre-programmed manners. But some human powers do not develop in that way. For them, we need education. Education, of course, prepares us to make a living as business people, doctors, engineers, and the like. But there is, in Kant's view, also a much higher goal. Education should not only help all human beings to develop their talents, to set their own goals in life, it should also make us see others as equals who deserve respect, as citizens of the world, as he likes to say, and thus to promote long-term human progress. Accordingly, Kant promoted liberal schools, such as what you can see here, the so-called Philanthropinum, or the School of the Lovers of Humanity, founded in 1774. Note, this is 250 years ago, and they're celebrating their own anniversary over there, by the educational reformer Johann Bernhard Basedow. Kant rejects the brutal punishment of children and adolescents, excessive memorizing of Bible verses or Latin phrases, and argues in favor of planning teaching so that it fits the developmental stages of young persons. He assumes that we will have talents, we all, and that it is the teacher's duty to carefully detect and nurture these talents. And he has an advice here, a very practical one, which goes as follows. In education today, it should be seen that it be difficult for the teacher, but everything is made easy for the apprentice. Previously, it was useful for the teacher to make things comfortable for himself and have the apprentice do the difficult work alone. The teacher did let the student recite everything, by which Kant means the Bible verses or Latin phrases. But the teacher should now think about how to best develop the student's weak abilities and prepare him. However, this new method will be very difficult to become general because the teacher's low salary, note, cannot motivate him to do this, and because cosmopolitan concepts are necessary for this type of education. So Kant worries that teacher salaries are too low for them to invest that extra effort, and I guess many will still agree today. And also that reforming school instruction would require a novel, so-called cosmopolitan mindset on the teacher's part, which not all had acquired back then. The ideal of education which Kant proposes is thus a demanding one, but he claims that we should not give up on it. And we must counter the tendency of, as he says, parents or princes who just want to educate the youth to adapt them to the world as it is. If you attend all 3 debates until tomorrow, you will hear more about such topics and themes. Now, let me turn to my topic, education towards maturity. Kant claims that we can become mature only if we have the courage to think for ourselves, as we know. I agree. But remember also his claim that we humans, unlike other animals, have powers that we can only perfect through education. Kant does not bring these two ideas together in an adequate way. Let me explain. For Kant, the most important human power is, of course, that of reason. This may sound to you like the ancient definition of the human being as the rational animal. Cats and dogs and horses, so Kant argues, do not reason. Or if they did, we would have to climb off the horse and treat it as our own companion. Well, many pet owners and other people will say that's not totally true, that animals do not reason. Many do. But whatever we think about the rationality of cats or dogs or horses, Kant actually rejects the ancient definition. He claims that the human being is by no means a rational animal already, if that means perfectly rational. The human being is, he says, merely an anima rationabile, that is, a being capable of reasoning, but so that we are all reasoners in this basic sense, but really good reasoning, critical reasoning, is not something that we do automatically. Kant's demand to have the courage to think for oneself is right. But this courage cannot simply consist in stating one's opinion against, say, authority or majorities with whatever courage one has. If we only do that, others have no good reason to accept our opinions. So the courage to think for oneself must be supported by educating the power to use reasons and reasoning procedures correctly. However, here Kant says very little. He does not tell us how to do that, and that is a weakness. We teach mathematics, science, languages, history, and make people go through universities and other form of specialized education today. No one can perform a heart operation without having had proper training. No one can play a piano concert without tireless practice, as we know. But somehow most of us do not think that our reasoning power requires a similar effort. Descartes joked that while everyone complains about their weak memory, all think that reason is the most justly distributed thing in the world. All humans find themselves reasonable enough and do not want more reason than they already possess. That's, of course, a joke on Descartes' part, but if you have that belief, that is wrong. We need to educate, train, and practice our reasoning powers much more. Why and how? Consider the why question first. There's a very abrupt move from Kant to Trump, for which I apologize here. We know that our democracies are in crisis. But why are we surprised at all that it is so easy to become prey to propaganda, populism, or political polarization? Sometimes I will refer to these three as PPP. We often lack the intellectual tools to defend ourselves from these attacks. So take Donald Trump's social media post. Here's just one to which others could be added easily, you know that. He frequently states his opinion and attaches then an emotional concept to it, like bad or sad or horrible, and I will not try to imitate him. He thereby hijacks certain weaknesses of our minds. Of course, other politicians of all sorts of parties do that too, if in lesser degrees. We need to educate everyone to see through such tragedies when they happen, through such absence of reasoning, and the earlier, the better. Good reasoning skills are important for democratic discussion and deliberation. An advanced reasoner possesses important intellectual tools for that. For instance, she has an enhanced power of argumentation. That is just one aspect of being a good reasoner, but a central one. Arguments, philosophers say, and logicians in particular, are a series of statements where one part, the premises, justifies or supports another part, the so-called conclusion, such that the conclusion is at least convincing enough, maybe even true, or at least probably true, or has to be taken seriously if one takes the premises seriously and the relation between the premises and the conclusion. There are different types and degrees of such justificational support, as textbooks in logic and critical thinking show. And if you have never had one, I recommend literally here Critical Thinking for Dummies, which is a very good entry for that. So here are two simple examples. As you can see, all cats are animals, all animals will die, therefore draw your own conclusion. Or a very controversial political one, Catalonia is a nation, all nations have the right to self-determination, therefore it would follow logically that Catalonia has the right to self-determination. But what does that mean? Why do we accept the premises? Do we take them to be true? In what relation do they stand to the conclusion? These are all skills that can be learned and trained and practiced. And an advanced reasoner is someone who has that. An advanced reasoner possesses at least, that is, three basic powers. She can distinguish between an argument and non-argumentative forms of speech, such as the mentioned examples of propaganda. She is able to construct or build her own arguments, and she can finally evaluate or criticize arguments that are presented to her, and should also do that with her own. She can judge them for how good they are according to norms and criteria from formal logic, the theory of knowledge, cognitive science, and related fields. But few schools nowadays teach these things systematically. These capacities are restricted to people who get a very much higher education, and sometimes not even to them. Teaching good reasoning is not an unrealistic fantasy, as you might think, or an utopia. Last year, and now I'm becoming a little bit practical, I started a project called Reason School, funded by the Spanish government. And here in Spain, as you should know, 2 years of philosophy at high schools are already obligatory. A recent law now also demands that schools should increase teaching skills. That is, no longer teach only facts. They've never done that, they've always taught skills, but the amount of skills should be increased at school education. And good reasoning, the detection, production, and evaluation of arguments is a great skill for democracies that aim to be more than just voting after polarized disputes. With the new project, schools will be teaching in a systematic and sustained manner the tools of logic, widespread kinds of fallacies, and psychological insights about biases and motivated reasoning. We have just started this year with 8 teachers from Catalan schools and from Valencia. Such teaching will not change things immediately, but we aim to bolster it in the rest of the 2 years of high school philosophy, and we aim to facilitate instruction with audiovisual and other innovative tools. As Kant demands, as I've said, to be effective, we must avoid making the student suffer. And I somehow hope that teachers will not suffer too much either. The reasoning will be taught also alongside different kinds of divisions, such as normatively correct versus mistaken reasoning. Not every instance of an argument is a good argument, as I said. There are different types of mistakes people make, whether they are cold mistakes or hot or so-called motivated mistakes in reasoning. And students will also learn to apply rules and norms not in a mechanical way, but in a case-sensitive way, in connecting it to their background knowledge, for instance. So let me sum up. Education towards maturity today requires a systematic and sustained teaching of reasoning skills. This, and perhaps only this, will provide the practical tools for realizing Kant's lofty demand that we have to have the courage to think for ourselves. Courage grows once the relevant powers grow. That is a lesson from other educational areas, from sports to music to math. Otherwise, courage might just be overconfidence or the trick of a con man, as we have seen. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've been celebrating the Kant's birthday pretty much all year in a variety of ways. The Einstein Forum just finished a big festival that included not only conferences, but art, music, and drama. But I was glad that Thomas chose the subject of education for his Kant party, because I think what Kant has to say about education is often misunderstood. Anyone who has heard anything about Kant has probably heard the beginning of his essay, What is Enlightenment? And indeed, since it was one of 15 essays that he wrote for the popular journal Die Berlinische Monatsschrift, it's no surprise that the essay gets a lot of play by people who are not professional philosophers. Here's the first paragraph, which some Germans in my generation had to memorize by heart. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from one another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but lack of resolve and courage. Sapere aude, have courage to use your own understanding, is the model of enlightenment. Now, that's the first paragraph, and the second one begins with the words laziness and cowardice. Now, all this sounds like a nice neoliberal mantra. If you're not enlightened, it's your fault. It's because you're immature, lazy, and cowardly. All you need to do is pull up your socks, take responsibility for becoming mature, and the world will take care of itself. When I read this text about 10 years ago while working on a book called Why Grow Up, I was astonished because the first paragraph leaves the impression that it's all just a matter of individual effort, but the second paragraph undermines that entirely. I won't read all the second paragraph, just the most important lines. Kant writes, "The guardians who have so benevolently taken over the supervision of men have carefully seen to it that the far greatest part of them, including the entire fair sex, regard taking the step to maturity as very dangerous, not to mention difficult. Having first made their domestic livestock, house fee, dumb, and having carefully made sure that these docile creatures will not take a single step without the go-kart to which they are harnessed, these guardians show them the danger that threatens them should they attempt to walk alone. Now, this danger is not actually so great, for after falling a few times, they would in the end certainly learn to walk. But an example of this kind makes men timid and usually frightens them out of all further attempts." And Kant concludes, this is really important, "Thus it is difficult for any individual man to work himself out of the immaturity that has all but become his nature." Now, I hope some of you feel the same impact I did when rereading those lines. Kant, as always, was writing for the censor. Even so, the second paragraph of his text is a complete indictment of the reigning political structures. The guardians of society keep people frightened, so they behave like dumb animals, for the people in power do not want grown-ups who think for themselves. Far easier to rule over those who let their decisions be made for them. And with his reference to what the 18th century called the fair sex, he even undercuts some of the sexist remarks he makes in other writings. Women, in particular, are kept timid, made to feel that every attempt to think for themselves is dangerous. That's a systemic rather than a biological argument for what was indeed, in Kant's day, a deep inequality between men and women. I still wonder why everyone knows the first paragraph of the essay and how few people bother to read the second. It's not the transcendental deduction, after all. Kant's meaning is perfectly plain. It is almost impossible for an individual to become enlightened or to think for themselves because those who rule societies do not want to have to deal with independent adults. It's far easier for them to rule over frightened children, and they go to great lengths to keep us childish. Now, you may say Kant lived in the world of despotism, enlightened or not, and those of us living in the free West do not face the constraints he knew. We even have social media, so everyone who wants to can have a platform to say whatever they want. Don't worry, this is not going to be another tirade against social media, though I could make some. I will just point out a few facts. 1 billion people in China do not have the freedom to say what they want, and I gather that surveillance techniques are improving there all the time. And Israeli troops have deliberately shot over 100 Palestinian journalists in the last several months, a fact that you can read not only in the American media, many sources in the American media, but even 2 days ago in Fox News, not to mention Israeli newspapers like Haaretz. I could not find a mention of this in the German media today. But let's leave special cases aside. In the Free West, you can indeed say what you like, sometimes even in the mainstream media. There are two problems with this, however. One is the phenomenon that Steve Bannon, the far-right master who was once called Trump's brain, put succinctly, "Flood the zone with shit." That's a quote from Steve Bannon, not me. Even those of us who pride ourselves on being independent and enlightened and take time to read lots of different media sources are overwhelmed by it. And for those who do not have the time to follow news carefully will find themselves bewildered by it. The second problem is one I wouldn't have thought we'd be worrying about this far into the 21st century, but canceling is practiced heavily by those we'd traditionally call left and right. Go ahead and say what you like. You won't be arrested for it as you would in despotic regimes, but you might lose your job over a tweet. My biggest worry is not censorship, however, not even the soft kind, but another way in which the powers that be do what they can to make sure we stay in a state of herd-like dependence. And to understand how important this point is for Kant, we need to turn to the most important autobiographical text he ever wrote. I'm going to read this. It's striking, once again, how rarely it's quoted, but it really is very important. It certainly started my own work on Kant, but many other things as well. Kant wrote at a young age, "I am by nature an inquirer. I feel a consuming thirst for knowledge, the unrest which goes with the desire to progress, and the satisfaction with every advance in it. There was a time when I believed that this constituted the honor of humanity, and I despised the common people who know nothing. Rousseau set me right. This blinding prejudice disappeared. I learned to honor man and would regard my work as less worthy than the work of a common laborer if I did not believe it would contribute to restoring the rights of humanity." Now, like most important Kant quotes, this one is seldom read. While looking up the translation in a hurry, I discovered that the source which printed it left out the last line. I would regard my work as of less value than a common laborer. I suppose that's because if you focus on Kant's critique of traditional epistemology, the line looks crazy. How could a sane man believe that charting the nature and limits of knowledge would restore the rights of humanity? If, on the other hand, you realize that Rousseau, who Kant called the Newton of the mind, is always in the background of his thought, as a portrait of Rousseau was the only picture in his home in Königsberg, the claim about human rights becomes more plausible. I've no time to argue this in detail. I think it does solve Thomas's problem that was in his slide about Kant not telling us how to learn to reason. I think if you take Rousseau's Emile as the background text that Kant presupposed in his work, in the same sense that Newton's Principia was the background text to his metaphysics, you understand it. Rousseau's Emile, the only book that so engrossed Kant that while reading it the first time, he forgot to take the afternoon walk, which the whole town set its clocks by. Now, here's a passage about education whose content Kant reproduces in What is Enlightenment. Rousseau writes in Emile, "We were made to be men. Laws and society have plunged us once more into childhood. The rich, the nobles, the kings are all children who, seeing that men are eager to relieve their misery, derive a childish vanity from that very fact." Note that Rousseau thinks it is laws and society who plunge us into childhood, again, because governments prefer immature subjects to independent citizens. Contemporary expressions of that preference are best seen by industry's ability to keep us dazzled by a bewildering number of choices of automobiles or breakfast cereal, while keeping the really important choices out of our hands. In most cases, the immaturity that governments desire need not be achieved by force, for we willingly collude in it. It's easier, Kant says, to let others do our thinking for us than to think for ourselves. Totalitarian regimes, therefore, are seldom necessary and often counterproductive. For wherever the mechanisms of control are obvious, some bold souls will be moved to protest them. Sooner or later, direct control leads to rebellion. Indirect control leads to dependency. Simple and subtler are the infantilizing processes of non-totalitarian societies that encourage our natural laziness by giving us comfort through a range of toys. Of course, neither smartphones or automobiles are described as toys. Crucially, they're portrayed as the tools without which no adult life can take place. By contrast, ideals of a more just and humane world are portrayed as childish dreams to be discarded when you grow up in favor of the real business of acquiring toys. That is, finding a steady job that fixes our place in the consumer economy. It's a perfidious reversal that leaves us permanently confused. Call this a special case of laziness writ large. No wonder Kant called the exit from self-incurred immaturity the most important revolution that can occur within the human being. Now, post-Enlightenment people will not be content without some form of activity that expresses the desire to choose our life's journeys. And the neoliberal way of fulfilling that need is far more effective than anything totalitarian regimes ever dreamed of. We are kept dazzled, dazed by a wealth of small decisions. Steve Jobs revealed that the question of which washing machine to purchase could dominate his family dinner table for weeks. Nor did the brilliant inventor find the fact problematic. He offered it up as an example of democratic deliberation. Our opportunities for decision-making utterly exhausted, we ignore the fact that the important decisions are made by others we cannot even name. Or did you choose a world in which oil companies profit from wrecking the planet? Women are stoned for adultery or murdered for going to school? Children die of easily preventable diseases or are collaterally damaged by drones? Do your choices make a difference to any of these things? In sum, we must begin to read Kant's remarks on education and Selbstdenken as political remarks. This does not make the problem he and Rousseau raised any easier. But if we take them seriously, rather than expecting the individual to become enlightened without changing the conditions that seduce her into immaturity, we just might have a chance. Thank you. Stay here? Okay.
Thank you very much for two very synthetic, dense, and elaborate conferences. And I think you've opened many issues, and there are. It's extremely exciting to have the opportunity to talk about this here. I have, of course, some questions and some. I would like to start with the question about schools and education. I would like to bring the issue to something more concrete. And I wonder if you are not giving too much responsibility to schools. And while reading what you've presented today, because I had the opportunity to read it before, I was thinking about the text by Hannah Arendt, Reflections on Little Rock, where she states that the idea that one can change the world by educating the children in the spirit of the future has been one of the hallmarks of political utopias since antiquity. And I wonder if we think of schools as counterpower to the power of market economy, as a place of resistance, as a counterculture, as a place where we fight against media banality, mass consumption, and so on. I wonder if this is not too much of a responsibility for teachers who sometimes already spend most of their time just trying to keep children silent and trying to work with the few materials they have. And this is on the one hand, and together with this, we have to be suspicious of the ruling power, because the ruling power, as you told us, is not interested in that we think for ourselves. But if this is so, how suspicious should we be? How suspicious should we be of any state-centered initiative, educational initiative of state-oriented education? I'd like just to put these two questions to start with.
Do you want to start?
Okay. I can start. There's much to be said here, particularly about Hannah Arendt's remark, but I want to keep it very short in the interest also of...
Yeah, how much time do we have?
We have 15 minutes, 20 minutes for our round, and then we are opening it up to everyone. What we are trying to teach through that program is not more difficult than the kind of high school mathematics and physics, which I know is difficult, or can be difficult, but it's not more than that, right? And we have not been practicing teaching critical reasoning in a systematic and sustained manner in our societies before. The teachers that we have, at least the first cohort that we taught in a curso de formación, which was organized with the help of the Catalan government, by the way, are very motivated, and we will see how it goes. We will make, after a year, an empirical test about how successful the students are with learning to improve their reasoning skills, and then we'll see. This is a piece of Karl Popper, the other philosopher, would have said, this is piecemeal social engineering. We try a reform, we test afterward what its effects are, and then we reconsider, step by step by step. No? So the feasibility of what I'm proposing is in general not higher than anything that students learn already at high school. The second thing is the teachers that we are working with right now are very motivated. Maybe not all teachers will be alike, because we had the fortune of, we looked for voluntary participants, and of course those who agreed to take part in this curso de formación, they were doing so voluntarily, and so they had likely a higher motivation than many other teachers might have. But we'll see. Again, piecemeal social engineering. The second thing, we had full government support, and there was no suspicion that there is any danger to the government if we teach students to think critically. If anything, to the contrary, and precisely because of the situation that we are nowadays in, with the negative effects of social media, with the polarization that we experience in our society, and with the capacity of some skilled individuals to exploit certain weaknesses of the human mind. That needs to change, and that is a proposal that we're trying to follow up on. So against Hannah Arendt's remark, I think putting too much burden on the teacher's shoulder, we will also try to relieve some of the burden. Because right now, teachers in philosophy here in Spain, for instance, have 1 year where they teach from, as it's sometimes called, from Plato to NATO, from ancient philosophy to the 20th century, and they just learn a lot of facts. And I can say that because I'm more than 50% of the time, I'm a historian of philosophy. I do philological editions of Kant's works, and I study his own texts in the most historical manner that you might imagine. But at that age, I think that's not appropriate. They need to learn skills rather than facts. They need to learn to use Kant's own term, how to philosophize rather than other philosophies.
I object to the idea that there's something somehow wrong with giving teachers, this kind of terribly important role. I think they have it. I realized you, looking at your CV, Thomas, I realized you worked on that wonderful book, When Reason Lost Its Mind, with Rainey Daston. So you'll know who I'm talking about, a very, very distinguished historian and director of Max Planck Institute once said to me when we had children the same age, miserable in high school, if we were really going to be useful to the world, we would quit our fancy jobs and teach high school. And I still feel that there's something in that. Now, of course, there are people who go into teaching because it's a safe and simple job. But fortunately, I've had children in school systems in 3 different countries. And while I was never satisfied with any of them, there was always one teacher every year who saved the year for that particular child, because you could see that these people, not terribly well paid, not terribly invested with status, really were committed to bringing the world forward child by child. And I think that's what teaching is about. I think obviously we could make it easier on them with more resources and less rigid rules. I want to just mention what might be my favorite small fact in the world. Everybody knows the Pakistani Nobel laureate Malala. Everybody knows that she was almost killed for acting for girls' education. But not too many people know what kinds of things she did after she got that education, went to Oxford, and started looking around and making speeches. And one of the speeches she made was that you could educate every child, every boy and girl on the planet for 12 years on the profits made by the arms industry in, guess how many days? Just guess. Somebody guess. Okay, it's not that bad. 8, but 8. And when I heard that, I happened to be going to a meeting with a different Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, who's an economist and philosopher. And I said, can that be true? He took out a piece of paper, he made some calculations, and he said, yeah, that's about right, okay? Now, none of us know what to do about that, but it seems terribly important that we know facts like that and pass them around so that we could redirect our priorities. That's a partial answer. I mean, yes, of course I'm always suspicious of state education. I dropped out of school myself, It's, there are structures that need to be changed, but there are teachers within, and often administrators within, who are committed enough to that task that I think, it's there's a wonderful metaphor by the philosopher Otto Neurath. You have to build the boat, you have to rebuild the boat while you're sailing in the water. That's how progress happens.
Thank you very much. And there's in the title of the session today, there's the word maturity. And I'd like to understand a bit better this word. And we live in a society where to be forever young, it's important. People who is mature. I mean, it's not so clear that one becomes an adult. When one is 18, not even sometimes when one is 30, it depends also on the ability to have a home of one's own. And there is also, we hear very often the thing that one has to have to take care of one's inner child and these kind of things. So I'd like to know what does it mean to be mature according to you?
Yeah, so I wrote an entire book on the question. It's called Why Grow Up, Warum Erwachsen werden. It's in a bunch of languages. Because I think all of that is a lie. And I love Bob Dylan, but I think Forever Young is the worst song he ever wrote because it bought into the idea, which I think is a political idea, that becoming an adult is a sad, resigned, painful process where you're meant to give up your hopes of changing the world or even changing yourself, settle down and accept the world as it is, stop having adventures, stop feeling joy. And, you know, the funny thing is, if any of us thinks about our own lives, I mean, there's some people who are somewhere in that age in the audience, and some of us are not, but the years between 18 and 28 are usually the hardest years of people's life. And they're made harder by the fact that we are getting this message, oh, enjoy the best years of your life, which they're not, okay? But I think the only, and by the way, there are empirical studies showing that people actually do get happier at different rates, apparently, in different countries, but confirming the kind of self-reflective evidence that these are not times that you really want to hold on to or go back to. So the question is, why is this message about cultivating your inner child and these are the best years of your life, why do we keep hearing that against all empirical evidence? We hear it because it prepares us to expect and to demand nothing, okay? Now, anyway, I mean, I wrote a whole book about this, but if I had to boil it down to one sentence, I mean, the answer to your question to one sentence, it's a Kantian sentence, which is that growing up means being able both to see the world as it is and to see the world as it ought to be, and balancing between those two, which is why it's so hard. It's much easier just to focus on one or the other.
I have no, Susan is really the expert on this thing. I only disagree with her on one very important point, namely that was the worst song that Bob Dylan ever wrote. First, it's a beautiful song, I insist on that, and he has written a lot of other songs which are nearly catastrophic, I would dare to say. And we can go through the whole oeuvre piece by piece if you want to challenge me on that. Other than that, I think I never gave up on being a child. People who know me and see me at the tennis table or at the kicker table or watching soccer have seen that, and that's all I need to say.
No, but you see, when you say that, or when you give somebody as a compliment, oh, you look younger than that, or oh, you're so young at heart, and that's the problem with the Dylan song. You are equating being alive, being joyful, being adventurous, with actually a lie, being younger than you are. And that's something that we all continue to do in ordinary language, and I think we're doing ourselves and younger people, too, a disservice.
No objections.
Well, before I give the word to the floor, I'd have one more. I'd like you to elaborate on something that sounds understandable and clear, which is sapere aude. Have the courage to know, have the courage to reason. And I wonder if we shouldn't first be confident of our reasoning abilities before we start reasoning. What comes first? The courage? And it's interesting that it's also courage, which is not something one controls with one's reason, which is something which is a capacity one has. What's first, the courage or the reasoning? How do How do you understand this sentence, which apparently sounds very well? I mean, we have we had at our university a graffiti, says sapere aude, as if it was a self-evident message, which it isn't.
In the Enlightenment essay, it's very interesting to note that Kant demands one thing in particular for the courage to think for oneself, namely that freedom of speech or freedom of the public use of reason is guaranteed by the government, by King Frederick or whoever. But Kant also says in that same article that the person who uses reason in that way must be a person who acts as a scholar. That is, someone who is already educated and trained, right? You can't make public use, you can't say just your opinion and then think that that is public use of reason. No, the public use of reason requires a lot of education in the first place. And Kant doesn't elaborate on this particular point very clearly. And that's my disagreement with him, that I think he should have written, I mean, the philosopher of reason who writes so little about how to actually educate people to reason better. You disagree. Let me just finish. The courage grows as the power of reasoning grows. And it's the same thing with everything that you practice. If you want to become an accomplished piano player, you can't play the piano concert after a day, right? After a day of practice. You will have to have those 10,000 lessons, hours, or however it is, whatever cognitive psychologists say about that. And the philosopher Michael Dummett, a philosopher of language, once told the joke, I think it's by P.G. Wodehouse. Someone was asked whether they can speak Spanish, and the person answers, I don't know, I've never tried. I've never tried. Of course, you have to learn that first, and then your Spanish or your Catalan or your French or your English grows better and you get more courage. I think that needs to be strengthened and emphasized.
So I agree with that, Thomas. And I'm all in favor of education, a lot of it, if it's the right kind. I also think courage can indeed be a matter of reasoning. That is, if you're talking to a child or a student or even a friend who's afraid to do something, you can actually reason with them and say, is it really so frightening? Can you imagine going a little bit further? But I agree with Thomas that, the more you reason, the more you have the courage to reason. The only thing that I disagree with is that Kant didn't have a view about how to reason. He really did, and it's all in the Emile, okay? I mean, I really think you have to take that text, and he says it in various places, and the Philanthropinum was based, as much as any school could be based, on Rousseau's Emile, that this is how you prepare a child to think for himself, unfortunately not herself, as we see in the 5th book of the Emile, but this is how you prepare a child to be an independent, well-reasoning member of a free society. So it's all there. I think he's just presupposing it and feels like, hey, everybody read that already. I don't have to write it again.
Well, I will open now obro a l'audiència per qui vulgui fer una pregunta. Penso que la poden fer en català. I guess you should turn this. Yeah. Sí, una per aquí i una per allà. Potser agafem aquesta aquí al davant primer. We pick up. Bueno, primer hem de comprovar que ho escolti bé. Sí, el 2.
Yeah, mine is not hearing anything.
Can you hear something?
Okay, so what would be into English?
Number 2.
Yeah, it's not.
They say number 2 into... No.
Actually, I'm unfortunately not
El 2. Número 2.
I'm not hearing anything.
She's not hearing anything. Let's see. El volum. Aquí hi ha el volum. No? Yes, okay. Bueno, problema tècnic solucionat. Endavant, si us plau.
Ok. Ante todo, muchas gracias por simplificar tanto las ideas, ¿no?, que son tan complejas. Cuando yo estudié Kant y sigo leyéndolo, no puedo más que asociarlo, como es obvio, con el modo de vida que tenemos hoy en Occidente, ¿no? El liberalismo, el iluminismo, el sistema que nos gusta vivir a muchos aquí. Pero, sin embargo, no podemos dejar de pensar, yo al menos, en los leviatanes, ¿no? Acaba de publicar un libro hace poco John Gray, The New Leviathans, ¿no? El estado absoluto, ¿no? Y esto me lleva a pensar en qué pasa con lo que la neurociencia y la realidad nos está mostrando de estados absolutos donde la gente tiene una serie de creencias, y esta es una pregunta: ¿qué pasa con las creencias? ¿Qué pasa con ese pesimismo de Hobbes por el cual tenemos que preguntarnos hoy por qué mucha gente no le interesa vivir ni con democracia, ni con pensamiento crítico, ni con razonamiento, sino que está encantado, a pesar de que razona, de vivir en regímenes donde bueno, se le quita la libertad a cambio de la seguridad o de una creencia en el más allá, religiosa, o una gran parte del mundo, la mayoría de hecho, donde ni siquiera se ha instalado lo que llamamos la democracia liberal, el iluminismo. Y otra pregunta incluida es: ¿será solo un accidente histórico esto del razonamiento, el liberalismo, en la historia del planeta que se ha dado en esta región del mundo, y pasará como un accidente histórico?
Well, you're asking a lot of really good questions, and I'm assuming I'm supposed to answer all of them in about a minute. So let me just start by saying I have not read this book of John Gray's, but John Gray is a preacher of the world is going to hell, and there's nothing we can do except continue to read it, to repeat it. He repeats the same thing, I mean, in all the books of his I've read. He is an absolute enemy of the Enlightenment, and I really don't recommend reading too much of him, okay? I mean, I don't think he understands the Enlightenment. I think he's one of these people who... One of the seductions of pessimism of that kind is that it allows us to be very lazy and comfortable. If we really think that there's nothing we can do to resist the world going downhill, and that most people don't want it in any case, then why should we exert ourselves? It's better to get stoned, or, you know, whatever form of dulling your senses you prefer, okay? You know, you've raised so many questions that I'm trying to, you know, sort of suggest the most important answers to them. But here's one. You said many people don't live in democracy. Most people don't live in democracies at this moment in time. And one way or another, either because they live in real tyrannies, or as they're sometimes called, authoritarian societies, which sounds somewhat nicer, or because, as I tried to say in my little talk, we are lulled into believing that democracy, that thinking, that independence is really all too difficult, and we're, you know, burdened by a series of tiny little decisions about consumerism, which give us a sense that we're doing something or other, and we have no energy to do anything else, okay? So most of us are not living in democracies in one way or another. The question is, do you want to think of yourselves as having agency in your life and doing something in the world? Or are you content to be, you know, one more or a more or less pleasant or expensive way of lulling yourself into sleep before you die. And I really think that most people, if the choice is painted that clearly, and if they see other examples of inspiring people who say, no, I'd actually rather be alive and try to change something, I think most people will be inspired.
I want to disagree about one factual claim that you make, that not most people live in democracies nowadays. Kant is very good at having patience. He says that sometimes changes needs centuries, if not millennia. And if you look back at the last 250 years, whether you count it by the number of states that have relative democratic governments or by the number of people living in states around the world that are counted as democratic, we have reached, particularly in the last century, a percentage of about 50% on both counts, where we were 100 years ago at 1 or 2 or 5% perhaps in both cases. And whether you count the number of states that are democratic or whether you count the number of people who live in these kinds of democracies. Now, democracy, of course, is a graded concept, so to speak. It comes in different degrees, as we all know. Freedoms grow and have to be fought for, but that too has been, if you look back the last 200 centuries, to some extent a success story, and that can be taken as reasons to be moderately optimistic. Does that mean that everything is guaranteed, that we will progress like that? No. And here I am in complete agreement with Kant. We can always fall back into barbarism. The threat is always there. But then it depends on us.
So Kant is not an optimist. Kant makes a distinction between optimism and hope. And I think it's a very important distinction to remember, okay? Optimism is about the way the world is, and hope is about the possibility of changing it. And like you, I'm very keen on pointing out instances of progress. I do it all the time. I did in my last book. But when we talk about the majority of the world, all we need to look at are, some of the largest countries, both geographically and in terms of people, China, India, and Russia, none of which can be described as real democracies. India's on the brink, depends on which Indian you talk to, but we had a little movement of hope in the last elections that it wasn't falling into total fascism, but so that those are just, and we can name some other places which are in no sense of the word democracies. But I think we also need to be careful in judging the genuine democratic nature of even traditionally democratic states. So, but I'm all about hope, just not about optimism.
Continuing maybe on the same front, when talking about Malala, maybe there would be also an interesting guess what the average, school years globally are, because going to 14 years or 12 years is great, but it should be also clear that we are already at 8.6 on average, global average, right? So, but this is just one thing. For cynicism or also negativity, I don't know, this is always my question, are we thinking a little too bad about things? And you said in particular, well, the ruling power would not be interested in us thinking for ourselves, basically. And so should I think about it like that, that we have these kind of debates, that this is all coming from the individuals? Because actually, systematically, there is no interest whatsoever to have the individuals, thinking for themselves. Is it really like that?
Maybe I presented too bleak a picture in too short a time. If I did so, it's because I really don't want us to be lulled into the idea that I think people who only read the first paragraph of Kant's What is Enlightenment are lulled into, which is that if we don't think for ourselves, it's only because we're lazy and cowardly, okay? Because I think it's important to notice
that there is this systemic aspect that was true in Kant's day, okay, and is true in a different sense in our day. This is not to say that every politician and every government is, committed to turning us all into children. But there's a tendency that I think we always have to worry about, be aware of.
I agree, this time.
Jo crec que podem encara recollir una pregunta més, que jo crec que ja serà l'última, si us plau.
Thank you to both of you for your talks, for the ideas that you presented. I wanted to ask, I understand that maturity requires autonomy of reason, but it also requires, or at least reason requires in Kant, also thinking from a universal standpoint. So putting oneself in other shoes, and I'm working on common sense, so that's where the question is going. I was recently reading Rosenfeld's History of Common Sense, and she was talking about common sense as an imagined authority that was built to work against the imagined authorities of the church and the government, but it was not more necessarily linked to reason than the authority of the church or the authority of the government. So and I think this aligns to with the flood of shit that we have in public debate right now. I think our common sense right now isn't necessarily reasonable. So my question is, how can we build now a common sense that, like the one that Kant proposed, is based on reason? Is that possible? How could we do that?
Thomas, do you want to ask?
Well, when you went for the point of universalism as required by reason, I wanted to make a kind of historical seminar remark that this famous demand of Kant's to think for oneself, to sapere aude, is actually, and that's not noticed either, another important passage that people don't read enough of Kant's, in his late Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, which I recommend, he says that the real thinker, the class of thinkers, people who think for themselves, have actually three different maxims that they use. The first one is to think for oneself in matters of interest. You don't have to think for yourself. You can do certain things mechanically. But when it comes to push in important matters, then you ought to think for yourself. Secondly, you ought to think consistently, that is, by rules of good reasonings, broadly speaking. And thirdly, you have to put yourself in the shoes of other people all the time. And in the Anthropology also says that our natural inclination to think from our own point of view, which he calls the egoistic perspective, needs to be supplemented, needs to be complemented, needs to be corrected by taking a cosmopolitan point of view. This is exactly what you meant. And so when Kant speaks about common human reason, we have an expert actually here in the crowd, and I think he's going to talk about that as well. And I mean, Martin Sticker. You should actually talk to Martin about this also. That common reason is something, the use of which requires such principles as well. Not only thinking for yourself and thinking, well, whatever I've figured out by myself, if it's cogent enough, if it looks good to me, that's enough. No, you have to take seriously opposing standpoints. Think about the rule of considering the opposite of exactly what you normally believe. What might be the reason why a person who you think otherwise is perfectly normal and healthy has a strongly different opinion than you have? You have to go through this. You have to apply what is called in philosophy the principle of charity to the reasoning of that person. The more irrational her belief and her arguments appear, the more you have to assume there is a kind of reasoning, and I have to make an effort to figure out where we really disagree. It's complicated, and it's demanding, but it's not impossible.
So I would agree with what
Thomas has just said. I never came across this book. You said Rosenfeld is the author? History of Common Sense? Okay, I wrote it down, and I'll check it out. I have to say that I'm always a little nervous about people who oppose something else to reason. There has been, a concerted attack on reason for a good 100 years or so by people who differed from each other as much as Heidegger and Adorno. They couldn't stand each other, but they both carried out, really full frontal attacks on reason, and Foucault added to it, and we think we've learned that reason is, not only is it white male and Eurocentric, it's also domineering and rapacious and, contrary to nature. So I don't know if she goes in this direction. I'll check it out. Okay, good. I'm glad not. I mean, Kant doesn't think that reason is the only faculty at all, okay? He thinks there are other faculties, but interestingly enough, the faculty that he says that's actually most crucial, which is judgment. He says it's something that can be learned, but it can't be taught, he says in the first critique. And then he writes the third critique, which doesn't really tell us about judgment either. So, so I'm not sure how to answer your first question, but I very much appreciate the emphasis on universality, and I would only add to Thomas's remarks, this is why I think it's so tremendously important to learn languages and immerse oneself in, you can never immerse yourself in all other cultures, but pick a couple and throw yourself into them. And that's the best possible way to be able both to learn to think from the perspective of someone else, also to understand your own assumptions, because it's only when you've lived and worked in another language and set of assumptions that you realize, oh gosh, I assumed the world was like this, but actually here are people who, have completely different presuppositions. So you learn both about yourself, you learn both about another culture, and you learn about universality. This is why universality or universalism is not, the view from nowhere. It's about gathering as much as you can from different perspectives.
Moltes gràcies, Susan Neiman. Moltes gràcies, Thomas Sturm. Moltes gràcies a tothom. Ara hem de fer una pausa breu, entre 5 i 10 minuts, per tant 7 minuts i mig, aproximadament, aplicar una mica de sentit comú, com es deia aquí. Això vol dir que trigarem aproximadament 12 minuts, en realitat, com solen ser les coses, però vaja, esperem que, intentem mantenir-nos per tal de poder després aprofitar que els següents ponents puguin esplaiar-se com toca d'aquí poc. El segon debat, que és amb el títol Educació per a la moralitat, però com?
Schön. Du bist ja gut bei...